If you have your Bibles, I'd like to invite you to turn with me in the Old Testament. We're still in the book of Ecclesiastes, now in chapter 8. So if you have your Bible, turn with me there. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. And we're looking at verses 1 to 17. Okay, so this is the whole chapter. This passage is also printed at pages 2 and 3 of your bulletin. Listen now to God's word. Who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and a wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be. For who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit, or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I have observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man hath power over man to his hurt. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place, and were praised in the city, where they have done such things. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There's a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. And I command joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful. For this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out that the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We've been looking at this strange book in the Old Testament called Ecclesiastes. It is a walkthrough, if you will, by a wise old man called the preacher, in some translations, the teacher. This translates the Hebrew word, of course, kohelet, the assembler. So we interchange those terms as we go through. And now we're looking in this chapter on what Kohelet observes to be inequities under the sun. Imbalance between relationships. Now, I need to remind you that the phrase under the sun is a shorthand, if you will, that the preacher or Kohelet uses to describe life that is pursued without a conscious and conscientious God principle. So life that is lived, in modern terms you can say deistically. There is God, but He's not really personal God. He's there, He created the world, and He's left it to its own with its natural laws and whatnot. And that's essentially what Kohelet is walking us through. He takes the position of the grand quester, not in singing, but he's questing for us in this life. He says, I've done this, I pursued this, I tried to make out the meaning and significance of different endeavors in this life under the sun. But he has a very wise refrain that he keeps repeating. Each road that he pursues under the sun, there is that common denominator. He says, the vanity of vanities. All is vanity and a striving after wind. You pursue wealth, that's vanity, it's vapor. You pursue fame, that too is vanity, it's vapor. All of it. And so now we're zooming in on this idea of under the sun, between individuals or in human relationships, there are inequities, there are imbalances. He begins this section with two rhetorical questions about the attainability of wisdom. That's in verse 1. He says, who is like the wise? And who knows the interpretation of a thing? And then he says, a man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. So it's not like he's saying there's no such thing as wisdom, but like we saw last meeting, wisdom is elusive. Nobody is ever really wise all the time. If you think you're wise, there's somebody wiser than you. If you think you're the wisest now, wait till you meet. Wait until you mess up. That'll show you. You're not all that wise. And so the rhetorical question there, who is like the wise? And who knows the interpretation of a thing? Who really knows what's going on? That's what he's asking. And so he begins with that. And I want you to take note of that, because that is the beginning bookend of this section. If you look at the very last verse, that is the closing bookend. He says, then I saw all the work of God, this verse 17, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. And so you see it very clearly, there's a bookend. It begins with, who's like the wise? And then it goes with, no one can find it out. Nobody is wise. And so we're looking at what is enclosed in that bookend. The technical term is the inclusio. So we're looking at what's in that inclusio. Okay? However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claim to know, he cannot find it out. Sandwiched between these two bookends of the passage is a section that explores Kohelet's observation of inexplicable injustices and inequities under the sun. There's a clearly perceivable tension in Kohelet's tone, as I can tell is in your experience as well. It's not very far from your own experience. When you look around in our world today, you see a lot of evils, don't you? We see all these evils corruption, inequalities, injustices, people suffering. And we feel a sense of grief, a sense of frustration, and even anger. We rage against these things. But more than that, we also yearn for a resolution to all these ills. A day of reckoning. A meting out of justice, retribution. And it is this tension between the reality of all this ugliness and brokenness on the one hand, and the hope for beautiful justice that marks the section that we're considering today. I want you to sense that kind of angst even in Kohelet's own words. And as usual, as we go through this passage, we will be considering it under 3 headings. You might think I'm a 3-point preacher. I am. Okay, so these are my 3 points. Number 1, inequities between rulers and subjects. This is printed also on page 3 of your bulletin. Okay, so inequities between rulers and subjects, number 1. Number 2, inequities between the wicked and the righteous. And number 3, inequities between divine and human wisdom. Now, boys and girls, little children, I have also provided keywords for you. I know that inequity might be a bit hard for you to understand, so there are keywords for you to ask your parents about when you go home or maybe on your drive home. Point number 1, rulers bully. I think that's pretty understandable for little kids. Okay, point number 2, bullies win. And point number 3, that's life. Okay? Rulers bully, bullies win, and that's life. So you want to ask your parents, Daddy, why does Pastor say that rulers bully, that bullies win, and that's life? Is that true? And parents, I want you to respond to your children by saying, in the text that we read, that we considered today, Kohelet is telling us about life without God. Without God, rulers bully, bullies win, that's life. I don't want you to end there. I want you to show them there's a better way. And that's what we're trying to do as well today. Okay, so number 1, inequities between rulers and subjects. This is we're looking at verses 2 to 9. Look first at verse 2 to 6. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme. And who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps the command will know no evil thing. And the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. What we see here in these 6 verses, well, or first here in these 4 verses, is a contrast that Kohelet draws between his readers, who we can safely assume are subjects. Not all of them are kings, obviously. Subjects, or in our case, citizens, members of civil society, and in contrast, their king, or in our case, our government officials or our ruling authorities. And there exists between these 2 classes of people, the rulers and the subjects, there exists between these 2 classes of people a clear inequity, especially in the ancient world. Ang utos ng hari hindi nababalik. The rule of the king cannot be broken. That's a Filipino proverb. And it expresses that ancient idea The divine right of kings. The kings are there because God has placed them there. They are God's agents. And therefore they are absolute. And of course you can only have one king. So everyone who's reading this, everyone who's considering this, everyone to whom Kohelet is writing, they're on the other side. Like us, subjects. And there exists, he says, a clear inequity between these two. But behind this inequity is also a principle of governance that we need to recognize and accept. Number one, we need to recognize that the authority of our rulers stem from God ultimately. All rulers, all authorities have their authority from God. That's what the Bible teaches. And number two, there are procedures and protocols that regulate our relationship with our leaders. In philosophy, we call this social contract. There is a social contract, essentially, that governs all authority and subordinate or subject relationships. Everyone who's born into any society immediately is part of a social contract. There are rules, there are laws, there's a government in place. And when you come of age, you have to pay taxes. Okay? There's a social contract, and really you can't opt out of that. You can opt out of your specific context. Maybe migrate to another country, but even there's going to be a social contract. Okay? And so that's a principle that we need to recognize. And sometimes it's abused, but in its essence, it's a good thing. It keeps order and harmony in a land. So that's number two. There are procedures and protocols that regulate our relationships to our leaders. And number three, our leaders have authority to punish lawbreakers. And so, because there's a social contract, and because there are procedures in place, and because there are laws for the common good, every society and every nation essentially has a policing power. The laws are in place to punish those who break the law. And these are the things that we need to recognize in spite of the inequities. The government often it can be better, but it has its use. So Kohelet is not advocating anarchy, obviously. And in fact, this is something that these principles, we see this, and I don't have the time to go there, but you want to write this down. In Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 7, Paul actually says these things as well, that we are to be subject to authorities. Okay? So having rulers is not always a bad thing. Having government, having leaders is not always a bad thing. Governance is actually good and necessary. But see, this is only the case in an ideal situation. And we know, countless examples of this, of tyrants, of dictators, of those who abuse their power. Crazy kings who burn down cities, emperors, who have CD writing software named after them. And so you see from history that there have been abusive leaders. In a perfect world, your leaders are going to serve you well. In a perfect world, the government is all good. But it's not. And that's what Kohelet here is lamenting. That's only true in an ideal situation. Kings or leaders, they too can and do abuse their power. And in such cases where rulers or authorities are wicked, the subjects suffer. And the inequity shows itself to be a pronounced injustice. A case in point from current events. There's always a problem of corruption in the Philippines. I think we've majored on it. The whole customs issue. LTFRB's overreaching arm, police abuses, a Comelec chief accused of having billions in ill-gotten wealth by no less than his own wife. Doesn't look good, but that's reality. There's corruption in high places. And the sad thing is, if you ask the question, who suffers from all of these? Who else but the subjects, the people? This inequity between bad rulers and victim peoples is a reality. Not just in our specific moment. This is a reality that was true in Kohelet's time. It is a reality that is true where there are, throughout history, wherever there are rulers who are also sinners. And so Kohelet, as with earlier sections of his quest, seems to find comfort in the one thing that no one can escape. The great leveler of humans, death. How is it in verses 7 to 9? For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit, or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. Now you might be tempted to think, well, there you go. Wherever you have people in authority, there will be oppression, there will be inequity, there will be injustice. So, solution? Communism. Classless society. But that utopian ideal has proven itself over and over again to just produce tyrants and inequity and injustice and hurt. And so Kohelet says, at the end of the day, at least everybody dies. At least that evil ruler will die too. And that's where he finds comfort. Inequities exist between the ruler and the ruled, but in the final analysis, death levels them all. And at least, right? At least. In the grave, there is no partiality. And there everyone is equal, whether powerful or weak, wicked or righteous. Well, in a sense. Because even in death, unfortunately, externally considered, there is inequity. And we see that in point number 2. Inequities between the wicked and the righteous. Look at verse 10. He says, "Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity." He's throwing his hands up again and he's saying, there's inequity between the rulers and the ruled, the rulers being wicked. But look at that. I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done the evil. Kohelet observed that there was a wicked person who, contrary to what one would expect, actually enjoyed an honored burial. His remains were paraded in the place of worship and in the city. He is honored and praised in the very place where he has lived out his very wickedness. We know this all too well, don't we? Consider, again, and I'm not trying to hit at communism really, but consider the rulers of the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea. The leaders are brainwashing, they're controlling the people's liberties, and devouring the citizenry, majority of whom live in poverty with their corruption. This has been the case since the armistice that stopped the Korean War. But notice, when Kim Il-sung died, or when Kim Jong-il died, they were honored as heroes and elevated even to a place of divinity. Even the current ruler, Kim Jong-un, is revered with such ridiculous devotion by the people. And Kohelet observes something like this, and he frustratingly remarks, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. And that's just to be expected. If it is the king who is evil, who will mete out justice? Who is higher than the king? You may have a wicked emperor who has killed people for sport. But when that emperor dies, guess what? He's going to be honored. He's going to have a mausoleum. And that's what he's lamenting. It's because that's what happens, he says. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily. The heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. It seems that these ancient observations still hold true for us today. Justice delayed, as they say, is justice denied. And then in verses 12 and 13, the tension in Kohelet is made even more evident. Have a look at verse 12 to 13. He says, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before Him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. Can you read the tension in him? He says the evil will not prolong his days, and then he says the evil, and he says first he says the evil, the sinner prolongs his life, and then he says, neither will he prolong his days. What's he saying? He starts by saying the wicked may prolong his life. That's verse 12. And then verse 13, it seems his theology kicks in, and he says, the wicked will not prolong his days. So how are we to understand this? He might have a long life of wickedness, but he will not have a long life of wickedness. What? Conversely, he says, it will be well for those who fear God. But wait, what's he really trying to say? Is Kohelet contradicting himself here? Well, yes and no. Yes, because one cannot have long life and not have long life at the same time and in the same regard. That violates the principle of non-contradiction in logic. But in light of eternity, in light of everlasting life, though the wicked live a long life here on earth, there is no enduring life for their wickedness. Here under the sun, just like a shadow that lengthens as the day progresses, the day of their lives will come to a close, and the shadow of their wickedness will cease to exist. There will ultimately be an end to the wickedness of wicked people. But as Kohelet asks in the beginning of this section, who can know it? Under the sun, who is wise to figure this out? And the answer expected is no one. No one under the sun understands this. No one understands this because no one under the sun is like the wise. Kohel's frustration tells him that justice must prevail. Justice will prevail. The wicked will not prolong his life. But really, under the sun, can you expect that? Really, under the sun, can there be justice beyond this life? Excuse me. Under the sun, who is wise to figure it out? No one. Kohelet's frustration tells him that justice must prevail, but how will this justice take place? When will it take place? In what manner? No one knows. Have you ever had that kind of frustration? Sometimes you watch the news and it's all just the bad kind, and you just shake your head, and even your heart is shaking its head and saying, when is justice gonna descend upon these wicked people? There must be justice. We sense that tension in Kohelet here. Because under the sun, there's no guarantee. Kohelet does not tell us anymore. He just expresses that hope. And his remark about the fate of the wicked and the faithful seem only to be hopes of an observer fed up with the inequities and injustices of the fallen world. You know, if you are living your life under the sun, you want nothing to do with God. Yeah, there may be a God, but I don't really care because He doesn't really care for me. Look at all the evil that's happening. Can you really say that God cares? Look, if that's the way that you are continuing in this life, I can assure you that you can look as far and as wide as you can and you will not find justice that you are looking for. That's just the reality under the sun. There's inequity between rulers and subjects. There's inequity between the wicked and the righteous. That's just life. Last point. Inequity between divine and human wisdom. In the next verses, the preacher describes what he considers to be another vanity, another absurdity. Have a look at verses 14 and 15. He says, there is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I say that this also is vanity. And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun, but to eat and drink and be joyful. For this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. You know good people to whom bad things happen. And you know people who are wicked, at least in your sight, to whom good things happen. This is vanity, Kohelet says. Oh, but this is reality. This is life, isn't it? Righteous people experience what ought to be experienced by wicked people. Wicked people experience what ought to be experienced by righteous people. We know this absurdity all too well. For some reason, evil people seem to flourish, while those who are faithful to Christ seem to suffer a lot. Kohelet is pointing us to the reality that sometimes justice just seems to be far off. And here the inequity does not seem to have a human cause anymore. Here Kohelet shifts his focus from human-caused inequities to inequities that touch on one's good or bad fortune. Things that happen to a man or a woman outside of his or her own hands. When misfortune, we have that term, misfortune, happens upon a person. That's not something that you schemed for. That's not something that you wanted. Your dog died. You figure into an accident. Your house is swallowed up in an earthquake. Why, God? Why me? You know, I caution you from asking that question, because God is in the right place to actually say to you, why not you? But then that's a frustration we find here in Kohelet. Good things happening to bad people, bad things happening to, well, supposedly good people. And it seems it is God who is in control of how things turn out in life. It's not their own doing. But the biggest question, of course, is why? Why would a good God cause the ordering of fortunes to be such that inequities exist? If He's good, why is there injustice? Now, this concern is known in philosophy as the problem of theodicy, or the problem of evil. If God is really good, all good and all powerful, why is there still suffering, evil, pain, injustice, inequity, etc.? It must be the case that He is either good but not all powerful. He wants to end it, but He can't. Or He is all powerful, but He's not good. He's malevolent. He enjoys seeing wickedness flourish. In either case, He can't be God. He can't exist. Now that's a classic way to put the problem of evil. But this formulation, this classic formulation of the problem, actually neglects two things. Two key things. Number one, it neglects the fact that no one is actually righteous. No one is actually undeserving of pain. That we do not suffer more than we do is actually God's mercy and patience to us toward. And number two, yes, God is all powerful. Yes, God is all good. But God is also all wise. Have you ever thought about that? Why don't they, if God is, if in God we see the perfection of all excellencies, then even wisdom, God is wisdom. He's good, He's powerful, He's wise. And if He is wise, God must have reasons that are beyond our imaginations. And here, this is what Kohelet seems to be driving at. The most important inequity, the inequity between divine wisdom and human wisdom. And he says we can't know it. Under the sun, all that can be observed is the vanity of it. That's why people rage against God. That's why there's this problem of evil, because they do not understand the mind of God. They do not understand how can God allow suffering if He's good and He's powerful. Have you ever considered, my dear friend, that God is wise, and if He is wise, He has bigger reasons than you can even imagine. See, under the sun, you don't have that. We can't know it under the sun, Kohelet says. All that can be observed is the vanity of it, the absurdity. And therefore, what does he recommend in verse 15? He says, and I command joy. For man has nothing better under the sun, but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. Look, there's going to be inequities. The rulers are going to be bullying you still. And the bullies are still going to be winning. That's just life. And so, what are you to do? Just make the best out of it. Try to find joy, little joys in whatever. In eating and drinking and doing your work. Accept your lot enjoy life as God permits you to enjoy it. It almost sounds, like this ancient philosophy of hedonism, Epicureanism. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. That's life under the sun for you. Have a look now with me in verses 16 and 17. He says, Kohelet says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep. He's talking about the BPO folks here. And I saw all the work of God that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. Masterfully, Kohelet here has demonstrated in this section the problem of inequity under the sun. There's inequity, it's horrible, it's senseless, it is absurd. That man cannot see beyond it. That's just what's current for man. He can hope for better days, he can hope that God explains things and makes things right, but try as he may, he will never figure it out. The greatest inequity after all is between what God knows and what we know. What is known in theology as, or what is upheld in theology by the principle of the creator-creature distinction. And so we come to the end of it. There's an important lesson for us to learn here. We cannot know anything unless God first reveals it to us. You see me smiling? You see me smiling because we cannot know anything unless God first reveals it to us. And God has spoken. Under the sun, rulers are prone to be corrupt, prone to abuse their authority, prone to be authoritarian and oppressive. Under the sun, the wicked flourish because justice is often delayed. The problem of these inequities under the sun is rooted in the fact that sin reigns. Sin taints and corrupts the very systems of governance and justice, so that these ills and evils have a safe haven to proliferate and to oppress. And demonic activity adds this on too. Paul reminds us in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And scanning this chapter 18 of Ecclesiastes, it would seem to us that aside from enjoying life, what Kohelet says, joy, he commends, which is fleeting and ultimately meaningless as well, there is another tyrant that looms over us all. An opponent that even the most wicked rulers have no control or escape from: death. Elsewhere in the New Testament, Paul writes, for the wages of sin is death. No one can deliver himself or herself from the consequences of sin, whether his own or those of others. And to be under the sun, to live under the sun, is merely to exist in a world of perpetual and meaningless inequity that only leads to a death that none can escape. But right now, I'd like you to have a look again in verse 8. No man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. Here, I'd like to suggest we have to see hope. There is hope in the reality that no one has power to retain the spirit. has power over the day of death. But this hope is not given to us positively, it's given to us by negative. Think with me, are these statements absolutely true of all people? Yes, of everyone living under the sun. However, there is one who has lived under the sun to whom these decisive words do not apply. Jesus Christ. No man has power to retain the Spirit but Jesus Christ, though He died, rose again from the grave 3 days later. And though each of us faced the consequence of his or her own sin under the sun, Jesus has battled with sin and the devil by living a life of perfect holiness and righteousness. He experienced the same inequities, the same injustices that we experience. But the good news is, unlike us, who respond to these things, usually in sin, He did not. He never sinned. He endured the vanity of verse 14 even. Bad things happening to the only good person, actually. It was an arduous battle, but Jesus was victorious where we have failed. And though our sins could not save us from God's wrath, Jesus took those very sins upon His body and absorbed the full force of God's wrath on the cross. Jesus Christ suffered the worst inequity imaginable. God becoming man, so that all who look to Him in faith and repentance can have the converse inequity of sinners becoming saints. Peter makes this clear for us in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that He might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. When we embrace Jesus for the inequity He endured as our substitute, then we can begin to see the resolutions to the pervasive injustices that surround us. We cry for justice, but under the sun there is none to be found. Thankfully, there is one who came under the sun through the greatest inequity possible, God becoming man, enduring the worst injustice, so that we, in Him, can experience a happy inequity. Sinners becoming saints. And hope is eventually that all these injustices, all these inequities, all this pain, this suffering, one day will end. Jesus will come again and He will restore all things to Himself. And that is our hope. And that is our joy. Kohelet commends joy that's no different from that of hedonism and Epicureanism. We know a better joy. Joy unspeakable, because Jesus has come. Jesus has lived and He has died and He rose again from the grave for His people. Only when we realize the extent to which God went in order to right the biggest wrong of sin can we begin to understand that its doom is now sure. A new ruler has come who does not cause inequity, but who has endured it and will surely put an end to it. When we learn what this means, then we can begin to understand that there is a greater hope that does not lie under the sun, but in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we give You thanks for this timely words, a word indeed that is timely to every generation oppressed by sin, every generation surrounded by inequity and injustice. And Lord, through this text, Kohelet shows us there is inequity between the rulers and the subjects. There is inequity between the righteous and the wicked. There's inequity between God's wisdom and human wisdom. And if we are to continue just under the sun, none of this will really make sense. And there will really be no justice for us. But we give you thanks because this is not all that there is for us. We give you thanks because in your goodness, you sent your Son to come to endure injustice and inequity, so that one day He can return as the one who puts an end to all of it. And Lord, we give you thanks because those of us who deserve your wrath are given this chance in Him to enjoy peace. We ask, O Lord, that you lift our eyes beyond what is just under the sun and cause us to fix our eyes on your Son. Because only as we understand these things, as you reveal them to us, can we begin to again hope in the midst of all the inequities and injustices around us. I pray, O Lord, that you cause your words to continue to dwell richly in our hearts. Drive your truths deep in us, not just today, but even in the days and weeks to come. We pray these things in Jesus' name.